If you have ever been told that you have too many interests, that you need to focus in on one thing and everything else is a distraction, there's this underlying implication that suggests that these other things, these curiosities that you have, these natural pulls that you have, are in some way wrong. And this isn't true. And one thing that I've observed is that by having different passions, interests, loves, they can often help you to outperform people that are single-minded. And my name is Joe Yulee. I'm a philosopher. I am absolutely obsessed with vocations and callings and paths. It's why I'm here on places like Substack and YouTube. It's why I host a podcast called Career Archetypes Podcast. It's why I have this online membership to help people to choose the right career path with conviction by unearthing their career archetype. Because it's my belief that everybody deserves to know what their calling is in this lifetime. There's no reason why we can't pursue it. And to not live a life where we're pursuing our calling is this tragedy, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I work with a lot of people, and many of them have multiple different interests. And they were at some point told that this was incorrect or this was wrong, and they just need to decide on one thing and choose one thing. And so they look at their vocation and their career paths as this either-or decision. And what ends up happening is that as they make this decision, they inevitably feel as though a piece of them is sort of like cut off and thrown away, and they have to just be one version or one facet of themselves. Now, as you mature and go through life, there are definitely decisions that you have to make. There are definitely things that have to happen in order for you to progress on your human path. However, one thing that happens, especially for people that are multi-passionate, is that they end up thinking that the things that they have to cut off are their passions and their interests and their loves, when really it's often they have to restructure their path in such a way that allows them to bring in all these different facets of themselves into their path. And that's actually how they start to excel at whatever their craft is. So I wanted to use this video to explore this concept a little bit and to show you how multi-passionate people can excel beyond others who seemingly just focus in on one singular path. And just to preface this as well, this isn't to say that multi-passionate people and pursuing a path in a multi-passionate way is the ideal. It's not to suggest that multi-passionate people are better than people that just focus in on one thing, or the opposite. It's to instead present you with some ideas that you can begin to stew on that might help you to realign your path so that you're working with your own naturalness, your own way of being, rather than contorting yourself into a mold that doesn't actually serve you, doesn't actually help you to walk your path. And so the very first thing that I wanted to sort of talk about is how your different interests, when overlapped with each other, brings about novelty and brings about this sense of originality, which often isn't in the paths of people that are single-minded in their pursuits. And the way to think about this idea is if you start to think about ecology. So if we connect ecology, it's a branch within biology, and there's this idea called ecotones. And so ecotones, the basic idea is that when there are two different biological communities that overlap, there's this originality or this vitality that happens at the intersection of this overlap. And you can imagine yourself standing on a remote island beach. Imagine you're on the sand and you look in front of you and there's the water and you're standing on the sand and behind you is the forest area. And you can see here that there is an overlap of these different ecosystems. And because of that, there is this originality that appears at that intersection. And we can use this idea to sort of express what happens when people overlap different ideas. And what goes on with multi-passionate people is that they often have these overlaps of interests. And because of that, they get sparked with original ideas at this intersection. To give you an example of what this looks like, I remember I worked with a student a little while ago, and she came to me not knowing what her path was, and we ended up figuring out that her career archetype was a sound healer. Now, if you don't know what a sound healer is, they will often do work with music and frequencies and hold sessions with people, and they use their music and their frequencies in such a way that it helps to sort of just get rid of all the energetic rubbish from your day and from your week, and resets you and brings you to a place of like calm or a state of peace. And they can use like sound bowls as a very typical way of approaching it. And so we unearthed her career archetype as a sound healer. Now, the interesting thing is once we unearthed her career archetype as a sound healer and she started to pursue this path, was that she started to look at how other people were doing it and started to say, okay, me too. Meaning that she started to say, okay, the way that I need to do this is more like ethereal, or it needs to be more watery, and it needs to have like a sound bath approach to this path. And yet in her own experiences in life, she was much more drawn towards like rock and roll, shamanic drums, and these like deep beats. And what was going on, and the reason that this didn't quite work for her in the beginning, was because she was rejecting these different interests and these different passions that she had from her path. And so we started to open the door to these things. We started to say, okay, what happens when we start to bring in some of this edgy rock and roll stuff? What happens when we start to bring in some of these drum influences into your work? And what ended up happening was that she still embodied the sound healer, but her work became much more activating, much more inspiring. She started to bring in this thumping sound into the work, and her work changed and suited her. And I remember her telling me that now it feels like it fits properly. And that was because we allowed these different interests to come into the work and allowed that to inform her of how to continue to navigate the path. And this is something that multi-passionate people can do, and they can do really, really well, is that they can allow these different things that they're interested in into their work, and it can help them to move forward, and also can typically help them to forge their way in the world that isn't presented to the world. So there's no sort of clear avenue. No one was telling her to go ahead and bring in these drum influences or bring in some more edge into sound healing, because the path was structured in a very particular type of way. But through her connection with self, it allowed her to forge her own avenue and stand out as well. And that leads me to a second idea to explore, which is that multi-passionate people often struggle with organization and discipline. However, it is easier for them to learn organization and discipline whilst continuing to bring in different passions and interests into their path, compared to single-minded people who end up really, really struggling with bringing in different interests and passions into their work, because it's just not naturally geared that way, and also society doesn't push or lean that way. And I remember I was reading Robert Anton Wilson, and he is an author and a writer. He writes nonfiction and fiction. And one of his interesting insights that I found when reading him was that he talked about culture, especially generations, getting more and more conservative over time. And he sort of had this joke where people would begin their lives as liberals, and then over time they would slowly become conservatives. And the idea being, and I agree with that completely, but the idea being that as we get older, we're less willing to take risks and we're less willing to try out new things. And so it's much easier for people that are multi-passionate to start to learn these things over time as they mature versus the opposite. And we start to look and open ourselves up to different paths and culture and notice that we're often told to pick one thing or to choose one thing to focus in on it. And yet there are so many examples of people in the world that are pursuing multiple different pursuits in their vocation. I mean, one that comes to mind is Childish Gambino. Then we have a comedian, and we have somebody that is in a TV show, and we have somebody that is in a movie. We have somebody that is a musician. Last time I heard, I think he was opening up a creative agency where he's just doing creative work through his agency. And you can see that he has so many different pursuits. And yet people will often say, well, he's just a random example and not everybody is like that. But it's everywhere in our culture. And not only that, but he's able to pull different ideas from all these different areas that he's been in and use them to his advantage. So if we were to look at somebody that is, say, for example, only focused on music and rapping, versus him who's able to pull in influences of, from my acting career, from my music videos, I can pull that into my music. My comedy, I can maybe bring that into skits with my mixtape that I'm making. There are so many things that he can pull and so many from so many different areas that allows him to excel in a way that nobody else can do it. I remember when I saw, just on this topic of music, when I saw Kanye West way back in the early days, and he said a statement like, I want to be the best dressed rapper alive. And this was very, very foreign to that environment, to that culture. And so he started to bring in high designer clothes. I mean, he was wearing Ralph Lauren way back in the early days. And so he started to bring in fashion into his music and really started to synthesize the fashion world with the music side of things. And now it's just become part of the culture where people are constantly bringing in fashion into the music, and vice versa. You often hear this kind of music on the runway, and rappers will go and they'll sit on the runway. But it wasn't like that back in the day. It required the synthesis, and that was just a deeply integral interest of his. He was very interested in fashion, so he started to bring that in. Another person that comes to mind is Lady Gaga, who was very much in music, and then she started to move and transition into acting, and she was pulling some of her musical experience into her acting. And so, like I said, it just happens all the time, and yet so often it's shunned away from culture and it's suggested as something that not everybody can do, or it's only for the special elite. And yet it's very much a part of the path for people that are multi-passionate. And this is something that single-minded people really don't have access to in the same way. It's really difficult to get somebody that is single-minded to start to open up to different interests or start to be curious about different things so that they can start to elevate their own work, especially when they're at a stalling point, which can often happen with single-minded paths. The other thing that happens with multi-passionate people and how they can continue to excel beyond single-minded is that they're able to make these connections with things. Like they're able to see the lights go on in different spots in seemingly different arenas, and they can make these connections across the board, and something that is completely in a different category to one person, for a multi-passionate person, like, oh yeah, I can see the link. I can see how that crosses over. It was interesting, recently we had a student in our space that unearthed her career archetype, and as she was going through this process, she actually was choosing between two paths. On one path, she was thinking about healing, and she was interested in sort of like Eastern medicine and holistic healing. And on another side, she was studying film and looking at cinema and also photography. And so she had these very, very seemingly two separate paths. And as she was going through this unearthing process and gathering certain self-knowledge about herself, she ended up realizing that these two things weren't actually separate, but instead made the connection as she was going deeper and deeper into her own understanding of herself, that her career archetype was the holistic creative. And so the interesting thing here is that it had both pieces of both paths, and there was a synthesis that came together and allowed her to bring these two things together in a way that was congruent to her. And this, again, you see all the time when multi-passionate people can make these connections as so long as they're gathering this information. And so when they start to store this information, potentially pursuing a path that someone like a single-minded person says, like, just focus on one thing, they actually lose access to all these different points of reference that could be useful for them later on as they progressed on their journey. And we start thinking about some examples, start thinking about someone like a Christopher Hitchens. So Christopher Hitchens was a very famous journalist. He did a lot of work in politics. Later on, he ended up doing a lot of work and speaking about religion. And he was a very, very famous atheist. I just disagree with many of his opinions, but it's very, very interesting to watch his vocation unfold and how his interests started to come together. And so he was interested in things like politics, like religion, like debate, like literature. And oftentimes you would find pieces of literature when he was talking about politics in his pieces, or when he was doing a book review, you would see some pieces about religion or politics and that. And so he was always dancing between all these different ideas and bringing it together through this form of the written word, and then later on in the spoken word. I mean, there were some debates that he would have, and you could see as somebody else was speaking that he had like suddenly thought of a certain reference point or a quote or a quip from a novel maybe that he liked, and he was ready to tell the other person his point that he had remembered. And it helped to emphasize his work out in the world. And one of the things that actually happened that was funny when I was looking at his path was that he was actually introducing at one point Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky is a very famous philosopher, linguist, activist. And when you look at Noam Chomsky's path, he actually started in linguistics and went really, really deep, made some massive breakthroughs in the field. And then there was this event that happened in the US, and the US ended up deciding to invade Vietnam, and he got really, really pulled into activism. And he had this choice to make. Do I stay within linguistics, or do I start to develop my understanding within the space of activism And he ended up doing both. He ended up doing, on the left hand, he ended up pursuing linguistics continually, still writing books about it. And on the right hand, he ended up pursuing activism and writing about the space of what was going on within the US and doing deep dives into it. And so at one time, he was pursuing two different interests with real intensity and depth. And to call it a dual path is not giving it the right sort of like qualities that it needs, because he had so many different facets of knowledge that came into combination through his path. He's very, very knowledgeable about history, and to say that that wasn't an interest, is to discredit that. But he had these different things going at one time, and once again, this idea of these different connection points coming into some sort of synthesis is something that happens with multi-passionate paths. And when they reject this side of themselves, or they reject this pursuit of pursuing a couple of different things or a few different things at the same time, or even sequencing their paths in such a way whereby they're pursuing something for a little while and they change and they pursue something else for a little while, they end up missing out on what their vocation could be. And so this is why it's really important to make sure that you discern for yourself and make sure that you're not putting yourself into that mold, because for someone that's single-minded, that singular focus on that path can be the right way of being for them. But to take that on yourself, like I said, ends up cutting yourself into pieces and fragments, and there will be this feeling of like, that's not quite it. This isn't quite working. It's like kind of fits, but it's not the real thing. And the final reason that I want to bring up as to how multi-passionate people can excel beyond the single-minded is that they're really amazing at wandering. And because of this wandering and because of this curiosity and because of this instinct where they're sort of following things around, even when they seem not to fit within the specific category that they're meant to be, stuck within, they end up stumbling on really interesting happenings and ideas and events and experiences that actually later on help to inform their work. I remember reading about the company Pixar, and one of the really cool things they did was they had their building designed in a very particular way. And the reason for this was that they created the building so that people would bump into each other. And so the reasoning for this was that because people would bump into each other constantly from different departments, they would exchange ideas. And this exchange of ideas allowed for the company, or at least the company believed, to be more creative and to hear things that wouldn't have normally come to surface. And this is very similar in the way that the multi-passionate person will wander. They're wandering around and they will bump into different things that are going to be of interest, that are going to be of use. They might not know how yet, and they might not be apparent yet. But later down the road, something's like, oh, that thing from 2 years ago, or that interest that I got into, that I got really, really obsessed with for a couple of months, now suddenly that's relevant, and I didn't really realize how relevant that was going to be. And now it's right there in front of me, and I need it, and I'm so glad that I have it. And that happens all the time. And if you're not able to do that wandering, you miss out on that opportunity to be able to bring that part forward and to later on excel. And if you think about someone, the very, very famous Leonardo Da Vinci, who was kind of like the poster child of the polymath or the Renaissance person, and he had a to-do list that's very, very famous. You can look it up, Leonardo da Vinci's to-do list. And it just had the most interesting things. It would be like, go to the other side of Italy and, look in the river, or go and look at a bird and like study its beak, and go and look at this particular flower and ask this other person over here how they can make this particular tool. And it just had this wide range of curiosities that he was clearly interested in and would go ahead and pursue. And if he didn't go ahead and pursue those things, then he could have potentially been on a single-minded path where he was walking in a very traditional way and missed out on gaining all these insights and all this knowledge. And then we wouldn't have the works of art that he brought forward, like the Mona Lisa. And I personally see this in my path as well. I am walking this path where I'm very, very invested in trying to understand vocations and how they develop, particularly for creative people and people that are spiritually inclined. And if I was to just only learn from other places within the career landscape, then I wouldn't be able to bring in all these other facets and make these deep sort of new understandings in the field. So, for example, I get very influenced by Jungian psychology, astrology, dissecting of interests, mythology, esotericism, sociology, labor economics. There are so many different fields that I will find myself peering into because it gives me an understanding of the landscape that I feel without it loses that substance and loses that soul of what really needs to be done in this space. And so if you are someone out there as well that has been told, like, hey, you just need to focus in on one thing and remove everything else out of the way, and you know within yourself that, hey, I am somebody that is interested in many different things, then I would highly encourage you to start to look at these things and allow them into your work and see how they fit. Now, not everything is meant to be within your vocation. Some things are meant to be hobbies and enjoyed in a way that doesn't come into the vocational lane. But many things, often things that, don't seemingly quite fit, can be brought and woven into the fabric of your actual path. And by doing that, it actually allows you to excel beyond paths that are single-minded and are often stalling. And this is one thing that happens all the time in single-minded paths, where they stall because there's no new ideas coming into the field. And many of the ideas that need to be in the field are either in other subject domains or around other people, and they sort of aren't aware of this, and therefore they kind of just spin their wheels and no real progress is made. And if you are someone that is interested in learning how to go ahead and approach your vocation in a way that does feel aligned with your nature, maybe you are someone that is interested in many different things, then I would highly encourage you to check out our Unearth membership. So in there, I help people to choose the right career path with conviction by unearthing their career archetype. We help people that have never known what their calling is, and they end up coming into awareness of it for the very first time in their lives. We also help people that have been in their career for 10, 20, 30 plus years, and they're looking to refine it, or they're looking to make a change, but they don't quite know exactly what it is. So maybe they're at this career crossroads, and we help them to connect into what the next move is. And we also currently have this holiday study program going at the moment. So it runs until the 14th of February. And so if you are someone that wants to connect with your vocation during this holiday period, and you want to be around other people that are doing the same, we hold live group study sessions. It's very introvert friendly. We also have some masterclasses dropping in the space over the next 2 months. So if you're interested in that, I'll leave a link below.